All right, so it's Nic Harcourt, and I'm with Barry Ritholtz, who is, among other things, an equities analyst, blogger, host of the Bloomberg podcast, Masters in Business, where he interviews all sorts of influential figures in markets and investing. He also published a book about 10 years ago, which I want to talk about a little bit in this conversation, how it relates to this moment in time. It was called Bailout Nation, How Greed and Easy Money Corrupted Wall Street and Shook the World Economy. And that was, of course, talking about the Great Recession. And I don't know where we are right now, but where do you think we are right now? We had the Great Depression, 100 years ago. And where are we? What's going on?
So I've been describing this event as an externality. Normally, when you have some sort of a depression or recession or financial crisis, something has happened from within the world of economics or finance to lead to big problems. So if you go through history, the 1929 market crash and eventually was one of the factors that led to the Great Depression. There were all sorts of other economic factors involved, but it started within the stock market and the economy. The 2000 .com implosion was market began, and then we had a recession, 08, 09, the Great Financial Crisis. It specifically was economic and finance related, and they moved through these long cycles over time. I only half joking when I say market crashes are a feature, not a bug of equity markets. If it was steady and easy and not full of risk and not stomach churning, hey, everybody would be rich. You buy stocks, you don't worry about it, and it just goes up and up and up.
Sure.
The fact that it goes up and down is part of the risk factors, part of the psychology of humans in a crowd acting like a mob. That's how mobs behave. It's not rational, it's emotional. This event in 2020, it's hard to find parallels. The two closest parallels are the tsunami that led to the nuclear disaster at Fukushima, and maybe even worse, the asteroid that came, I think it was 67 million years ago, and killed all the dinosaurs. It's just out of the blue. And here's the ironic thing. The asteroid metaphor works better than you would imagine, because we have these big asteroid hits regularly. It's not clockwork. It's not every 67 million years, but there is a frequency to how the Earth is moving through various parts of the it's actually the sun orbiting around the center of the Milky Way galaxy, and it goes up and down over the galactic plane, and at different parts we pass through different areas, and apparently gravity causes all sorts of disruptions, and this happens with surprising regularity. I've actually researched this, and it's utterly fascinating. So anyway, we had this event, and we've been getting pandemics pretty regularly, but we've more or less
the last pandemic. I mean, the Spanish flu pandemic. I mean, how?
No, that was 100+ years ago. That was 1918. We've had a bunch of pandemics over the past 20 years. We've had the swine flu and the chicken virus and the Ebola and MERS, and there's one after another, because in the natural world, mutations happen all the time. It's a constant thing. And when a new mutation comes along that is very opportunistic and very contagious, it could spread like wildfire. Hey, there's a reason Ebola was so scary, not just because it's a terrible way to die and it's almost always fatal. It was so incredibly contagious. The host would jump from, not just living hosts, but, deceased bodies. So we get these all the time. And two things made this one so different. And this isn't me sharing pop theories. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an epidemiologist. And I hate when people on TV say, I'm not an epidemiologist, but here's my medical view of it.
Sure.
I'm looking at this as a layperson saying, Well, it's pretty clear this virus is very, very contagious relative to other viruses we've seen. And it's also clear that the United States has completely mishandled this virus. We're 4% of the world population. We're between 22 and 24% of the deaths and infections. You know, Canada is very similar to us in terms of geography and location and everything else. Their death rate is less than half of that in the United States on a per capita basis. And if you look at Japan, is a totally different culture and environment. They're a tiny fraction of ours. So we really blew this. We did a terrible job with this. And people find the disconnect between the stock market and the economy very confusing. But when you dig into the data and look at it, it's actually much less confusing than appearances are. It's one of those cases where you see the world from, your perspective of the world, could create this sort of false model of the economy of the country and lead you to say, hey, everything's crazy. But when you dig into it, yes, the lockdown seems to be an appropriate way to handle it, assuming you do it right, you do it substantially with all the testing and tracing and all of the PPE equipment. I still to this day don't know why the president hasn't exercised the Defense War Powers Act to say, like you still can't find sanitary wipes. It's hard. It's gotten easier to get masks. We're just sort of half-assing our way through this with the same results that you would imagine. And so the pushback to what's been going on is, well, then why is the stock market up so high? And I'll give you two answers to that. First, the companies that are doing well were built for this sort of environment. Some are obvious. Everybody's home, nothing to do. They're streaming Netflix. Of course, Netflix is doing great. But the work from home companies like Zoom and Slack and Microsoft and Apple, they're doing fantastic. The home delivery companies, Target, Walmart, and especially Amazon, they're doing spectacular. The Facebook, what else do people have to do but to spend time on Facebook? But here's the really crazy thing. The rest of the world that's managed this much better, these are global companies, but for Amazon, all of them get at least half of their revenue or more. Some quarters, Apple is 60% of its revenue from overseas. So if the rest of the world is recovering and doing better, makes sense that these companies that are working well over there is doing well. Amazon, where would we be during lockdown without Amazon? So that's the broad view. If you really want to get granular, there's something like a million and something numbers of restaurants in the country. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of retail outlets. Most of them are not publicly traded. When you look at the companies that are publicly traded, they're much smaller. They're much smaller relative to the indexes. The top, let's call it 10 names in the index, there's about 27% of the S&P 500, and those are the best names. If you take all of the travel companies in the country, it's a teeny tiny fraction. The department stores are 0.1% of the S&P 500. Airlines, not even 0.25%. You could take the 30 worst sectors in the economy and just make them disappear tomorrow, and it's barely 2% of the S&P 500. So it looks irrational. It looks like, hey, the economy sucks. We have record unemployment. Everybody is stuck at home, not spending money, not going out to restaurants or shows or concerts or all the discretionary spending we do under normal circumstances. But that's not the publicly traded markets. That's the broader economy. Yeah. The broader economy is as bad as it's ever been during any recession or depression. In fact, to explain exactly how bad that is, we've recovered so much that we're almost at the bottom of the 08-09 recession. We're all the way up to the worst it got in 08-09, which is just hard to imagine how insane that is.
Well, clearly the markets, and thank you for explaining that, because it really does sort of break it down when you exclude all these businesses that are hurting from the actual markets. But that still, for me as a layman, doesn't explain how this thing can continue to grow with 30 million unemployed or whatever it is right now. And with, retail just disappearing, restaurants going under, my world, the music business, clearly no live music, and the amount of people who are unemployed. So I guess my question is, and we could talk about property and mortgages and all that kind of stuff as well. Is so as the market maintains and continues to grow, is the economy, the fundamental basics of the economy, going to support that over the next 6 months?
So it's a really interesting question. I don't want to get hyper technical, but when you look at the history of the economy and the stock market, people think they're very tightly correlated. They're not, especially when you look at it in real time. Yeah, when the economy falls off a cliff, the market usually drops first, and the market begins to recover before the economy recovers, because it is essentially an assembly of all the revenue and profits of these companies. So before a recession is really visible, it shows up in individual companies as they, as their revenues look good and then all of a sudden they drop. Different sectors are much more sensitive. They drop much earlier. The challenge is in the fact that the markets, all the economic data we get is backwards looking, right? So we just got non-farm payrolls. It was for August. We get that on the first Friday in September. We get GDP quarterly. It's last quarter. Economic data is always, here's what happens. The stock market is looking forwards and saying, this is what we're expecting, hoping, wishing for. Sometimes the stock market is wildly wrong. But most of the time, it does a decent job sort of sussing out what's going to happen. Just recognize the day-to-day stuff is just noise. It's very, people hate when you call it random, but it's pretty random. If you look at the longer-term trend, and if you just ignore the squiggles, it mostly makes sense, like 80-90% of the time. It's times at extremes where it stops making sense. So the best explanation for what the stock market is quote unquote seeing, and it's obviously an inanimate object, but it's a collection of decisions made with money by millions of people, is theoretically it's looking over the valley of the rest of 2020 and maybe even the first half of 2021. It's looking towards a vaccine sometime in the first quarter of 2021. And here's the thing that I think people don't understand. When there's a vaccine, you and I aren't getting that vaccine right away. First, it'll go out to frontline medical personnel and first responders and police and EMT and firefighters, and it'll work its way through essential personnel, and then whoever's most at risk, it'll go to people over 70 and people with comorbidities and blah, blah, blah. There's a process for this. Theoretical. It depends on who wins the election as to whether we're going to see a continuation of the sort of, what the hell, let's just hope for herd immunity, or a more organized top-down approach, right, that some countries have done very effectively and America has not. So, I'm always reluctant to read too much into the markets. Humans are really good at fabricating a narrative story to explain what happened. And I always ask people after they give me this wonderful explanation of, well, the market was betting on, Moderna's vaccine or Pfizer's vaccine. It's like, well, why didn't you tell me that 3 months ago before the market ran up 40%? Or is this just, narrative fallacy and hindsight bias, and you're trying to explain what essentially is unexplainable? Yeah. The future is uncertain, and the market is one possible forward-looking indicator, but it's not right all the time, and sometimes we misinterpret it, and I very well could be doing that right now.
So at the same time as, people are looking forward and talking about a vaccine, I mean, and as you correctly point out, we're not going to get it, first of all. By the way, I don't want it, first of all, either. We'll let those other guys try it before I have a go at it. But it's going to take a while. I mean, it's probably not going to get into the general population until next summer, right?
Right. That's what I'm thinking.
So we're looking really 9-10 months down the track before that is a possibility. And I understand what you're saying about, the various future people looking into the future and sort of seeing where we're at right now and thinking, well, if that comes online, isn't that a bet though? Aren't we still making a bet? And I know that's essentially what the stock market is, but you're looking at something that's never been never happened in our lifetime, right? I mean, I know you mentioned before, the other pandemics in the last 10, 15 years, but they were very limited in scope. And this is where I guess we get to politics, because the politics at the time, at least in the United States, took a really good look at what was going on and had things in place so that it didn't come here and we weren't, dealing with an Ebola outbreak in the United States, for example. When we look at this moment in time, and I know the election is just around the corner, we're recording this in mid-September. How much difference do you see as someone who has to look at the political layout and the political future? How much difference do you see with a change of government?
So this is a complicated question, and I'm gonna regress repeatedly. So first, most of the time, it doesn't matter who wins elections, and that's a caveat. Most of the time, there's some data that shows that markets do slightly better with Democratic presidents than Republican presidents. But to be blunt, in the modern era of the stock market, what do you have? 30 presidents over the past 120 years? It's too small a data set. You really need, let's jump in the TARDIS behind you and go 2,000 years in the future, and then we could put together, we'll get a spreadsheet and we'll come back with that data set, and then we really could see how much presidents impact markets. So presidents get too much credit when things go well. They get too much blame when things go poorly. That said, some presidents really screw up, and it's arguable that the combination of Nixon, Ford, Carter was dealing with that malaise. President Reagan got a lot of credit for the economic recovery. He probably deserves a good chunk of it, but the Federal Reserve Chair, Paul Volcker, at the time, is the one who really was the key architect of that, breaking inflation and a 30-year decrease in interest rates for literally 3.5, almost 4 decades. So people get too much credit and blame. The China trade war, you have to lay that at the feet of the president. I don't think that had a giant impact on the economy. It certainly hurt Midwestern farmers, and it hurt people who were dependent on certain Chinese imports. But, by and large, you have to hold Congress responsible as well. They're the ones who hold the purse strings. I very much blame Congress for the slow, mediocre recovery post 08-09. Look, we know how this works. Lord Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, wrote the book on this after the last Great Depression in the 30s that basically said when demand from businesses and households collapse in a very bad recession, it's up to the government to step in and replace that demand by cutting taxes, deficit spending, public works, infrastructure, building roads, whatever. And eventually, when the economy comes back, when that demand comes back from the household sector and the business sector, then you could bring the tax rate back to where it was. You bring the spending down. Like, we know how this works.
Got it.
The problem with that is that people who don't believe in government or ideologically don't like larger government hate Keynesian spending. And so they've argued against it. And when you really needed it in 09 and 10, when the economy was very weak and slowly recovering, that's when you counter-cyclically stimulate. Bad economy, more stimulus. What we've done, not only did we not counter-cyclically stimulate 08, 09, 10, but in 2017, we passed a $2 trillion tax cut into a roaring economy. The economy since 2010 has been slowly recovering, slowly building up steam. By 2016, we were back to the same level of employment. By 2017, things were fine. That's the last place in the world you need a stimulus. Now, if you would have spent that $2 trillion from passed in 2017, spent in 2018, if you would have done that in 2010, this would have been a much better recovery, a much healthier economy. Instead, we left all of that to the Federal Reserve. There's only so much that low rates can do. They cannot replace demand. They could stimulate it on the fringes, but how many houses and car leases can people buy? You want to put people to work, let them earn a living, and then go out and spend that money. I'm trying not to dumb this down, but I'm also trying not to get very complex, and
Sure.
a lot of this crap is really complex.
No, I appreciate it because, I'm not somebody who's, I don't live in your world, and most people don't live in your world.
Me neither. I don't want to live in my world.
Most people who are watching the news at night, if we can, if you can still do
Right.
that, really don't understand a lot of this stuff, like myself. So you're explaining it. If I can understand it, I think a lot of other people will. So thank you for,
Great.
choosing to do it the way you are. I think, coming back to the question of, change of government, and, this is always going to be an opinion. We all have our political ideologies and how we think government should work, et cetera, et cetera. But from the point of view of, everybody pretty much knows that the current president completely mishandled the response to the pandemic.
Well, 40% of the country are not willing to accept that.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. So not everybody. You're absolutely right. But to those of us who have not drunk the Kool-Aid, it's pretty clear what happened here. So how much impact is that going to have when we, because you say that the numbers are all based on the past, right?
Yep.
When we look at this year, if the government changes and we get a new president, obviously he's not going to get into office until January. One would expect, based on what he's saying, that things are going to get a lot more efficient in how we're dealing with the pandemic. What damage has this last year, or since March through the end of this year, done? How much extra work are we going to have to do to recover from that?
That's a fascinating question. So let me unpack that into two parts. First, big variable. Let's assume, but by the way, there's a longer discussion about elections and polling and what people don't understand about probabilities. If someone says it's an 80% chance candidate A wins and candidate B wins, doesn't mean the polls were wrong. It means the 20%. Hey, 90% chance of sunshine and it rains that day. The 10% chance came in. So the big variable in this, let's assume the front runner wins. Now the question is, how much does he win by, and what, more importantly, happens in the Senate? If one or two seats flip, which is pretty safe, if over the next 50 days, this 6, 7, 8% lead stays there, you're probably going to see 3, 4, 5 seats flip. The key caveat on all this is really about turnout. If the Democrats carry forward the 2018 turnout, remember 2018 was a huge swing. We haven't seen a swing like that
in the midterm,
really since the midterm elections. So 2010 was a big swing, the pushback to Obama by the Republicans, big swing. You have to go all the way back to the 70s to see another swing that size. So I think if that momentum continues and if the get out the vote is more effective for the Democrats than the Republicans, today or earlier this week, we heard Trump, the Trump campaign went into the summer with a $1.1 billion and somehow they pissed most of it away. That's kind of shocking with 50 days left to see the Democrat way ahead in terms of cash on hands. If that's true, and we've seen ads cut back in Michigan and Pennsylvania and key states, swing states. So let's just hypothetically say Biden wins and that the Senate flips 55-45. for most legislation, especially budget legislation, you need 60 votes. It's not just 51, laws you could pass with 51 votes. Yeah. But so look at what just happened with the skinny bill recently, the skinny rescue plan. So the good thing about Biden is he's an old DC hand. He knows how to horse trade. A lot of what people forget about is that politics is the art of compromise. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, which is eventually how you end up with bloated budgets and bridges to nowhere and that sort of crap. Yeah. But if he were able to come in with 54, 55, 56 votes, they immediately start targeting on who are the 4 swing votes we need to get 60. And hey, what do you want? You have an opportunity that you've never had in your career. The President of the United States is saying, what do you want for Colorado or whatever the state is? You come to our side on this vote and we will make sure you are reelected for as far as the so if they could do that, I would expect to see a 60-day lockdown to bang out the end of COVID, because we're starting to see a resurgence with the reopening of schools. Yep. Once we get into November and the flu season, when everybody's indoors, it's potentially going to get worse. You're going to see not a $500 billion like failed, but you'll see another $2 or $3 trillion stimulus. Listen, people forget Congress historically can't agree on renaming a library. They were so scared shitless in March 2020 that they passed a $3 trillion stimulus plan. And remember, the annual U.S. economy is about $20 trillion, of which $4 to $5 trillion is government spending. So if in an emergency basis, we spent another 50% of what we usually spend for the government, that's giant. So the Federal Reserve took rates to 0. The Congress spent $3 trillion. Unemployment got extended. Everybody got a $1,200 check who makes, I think it was less than $99,000. Plus unemployment got a bump up to $600. People who were unemployed, stuck at home with their families, they're ordering groceries. They're Walmart, Target, Amazon. Right. Those companies have been doing great because it's all government spending. Right. That is classic Keynesian stimulus. Hey, put money in people's pockets and guess what? Right. They'll spend it. So I would imagine that you would see another giant stimulus to pump up the economy. By the summer, we're sort of getting back to normal. More and more people are getting the vaccine. We're approaching herd immunity. But again, if I was an advisor to Biden, I would say pass a 10-year, $10 trillion infrastructure plan. Replace all the highways in the entire country. Take the entire electrical grid, which is old and shaky, replace it and bury it underground. Why do we have storms not lose power to what sort of wait, you're running power lines between dead trees strung up every 40 feet? What is this, 1870? Let's get modern, extend infrastructure everywhere, extend broadband everywhere. Like, just take the United States and make it competitive with any of the modern economies in Asia. If you look at what's taking place in Asia with their roads and their infrastructure and their broadband and their cellular and their airports and their just spend so much fucking money, people just don't know what to do with it. Because when we've done that in the past, which is what we basically did after the Great Depression, people think World War II ended the Great Depression. It did not. The Depression was already over and we were recovering long before World War II began. You need a giant set of programs like this. And there's a fascinating book called Americana, not mine, somebody else's. I just happen to have it here. And this author discusses, Bu Srinivasan, discusses how America has operated sort of a joint venture between the private sector and the public sector. And he gives tons and tons of examples, whether it's the patent system. The telegraph was originally funded by Congress. Radio was funded by the Defense Department. Semiconductors, Defense Department. NASA, just endless new industries. The internet from DARPA. all the things that are part of our lives every day came about because the government and the private sector work together. You know, what public company can make an investment and say, you may not see a return for 30 years? None. But the government can do that. The government can do pure research. We've moved away from that. And if I was advising Biden, I would tell him, put a man on the Mars, not because we need to put a man on Mars. I think it's a terrible place to live, but the technology will come out of that will be spectacular. I think this vice president is pretty savvy, or this presidential candidate is pretty savvy of the advantages of spending money, the advantages of infrastructure. I would imagine we would see, you know, he's got 2 years before the midterms. I would imagine we would see a series of things, all in quick order. Probably going to see a revamp of the Voting Rights Act, assuming that he gets enough of a majority in the Senate. So the advantage of a system like the UK, the parliamentary system, is when you win, the votes come with you.
Yeah.
But you're judged very harshly, and you could be thrown out at a moment's notice. You can lose your majority. So the U.S. system is historically, our system provides stability, but it's also much harder to get anything done. You need a sweep.
So essentially, you're saying, and I know this has been kicking around the comparison, you know, with the Marshall Plan. Like, it's a Marshall Plan,
sure,
which was how the United States rebuilt Europe, the defeated nations over there, and obviously the mess that had been made by Nazi Germany, and obviously in Japan as well. The money that was put into, you know, creating a vibrant, you know, democracies and economies. We need something like that now to be able to not just overcome what's been happening in 2020 with the pandemic, but what's been happening for decades of, you know, non-investment in the infrastructure of the United States. So clearly, if that happens, and we have a president and he has a supportive, you know, Senate, and he can do that, then that's going to change things substantially. What if that doesn't happen? What if, you know, we are left with a second Trump presidency?
So it really depends on what takes place in the Senate again. You know, what's fascinating about the various scenarios, and there's a wonderful website called 270towin.com, where you could literally click through each of the states, strong Republican, mild Republican, strong Democrat, and play with it. What happens if Pennsylvania flips, but Wisconsin doesn't? What happens? And so I mapped out about 5 scenarios. Trump skirts by. Again, he lost last time by less than 3 million votes, but 100,000 votes in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Florida pretty much won the election for him. He really threaded the needle. Here's the fascinating thing that people don't understand. One of the things we have a tendency to do is to result. It's, as the poker players call it, resulting. We look at the outcome and we draw conclusions from it, rather than looking at things probabilistically. Meaning, the takeaway that Trump had this Svengali electoral genius who figured out a way to win, and he's playing 3-dimensional chess and you don't understand it. Well, that's one after the fact narrative. Here's a different way to look at it. He got incredibly lucky. He managed to just thread the needle. My favorite example of this is I've argued with various people as to how much the Comey announcement 10 or 12 days before the election impacted it.
Right.
When you look at 100,000 voters out of 130 million swinging the election, doesn't take that much to get people to say, I'm tired of all the crap with the email and we've had enough Clintons. I'm done. Sure. Let's try something new. You could see. Right. I like the way this guy talks. He talks straight, but like I've had conversations with people about that. Now, to redo that is very challenging because you, as an incumbent, you're running on a track record. Right. You've done something that nobody's ever done before. You've never had approval rating above 50%.
Right.
Kind of rare. I'm a data guy. I like to look at that data. My 2 favorite data points about the president or the presidency: the day Richard Nixon resigned and went out onto the front lawn of the White House waved goodbye and got on Marine One,
Yeah.
he had a 30% approval rating. So there is a core base that is so tribal that nothing is going to get those people to change. And Nixon did not have Fox News. In fact, the resignation of Nixon is literally what led Roger Ailes to create Fox News. We have to be able to influence, he said, the public opinion and the outcome of sentiment. And if we had a Fox News, Nixon wouldn't have resigned, which would really scare the shit out of everybody.
Sure.
So I got to think that Fox News is probably worth 5, 6, 7, 8%. They're not a legitimate, in my view. I don't perceive them as a credible news organization. They have a number of credible news people,
sure.
but they're an arm of the Republican Party. You had Fox's own national security reporter
analysis,
basically confirm the Atlantic story that Trump called the war dead suckers and losers.
Sure.
She said, I confirmed it from 3 or 4 separate sources that are all high-ranking generals and people were there, and blah, blah, blah. The very next block on the show, they're talking about it's a hoax, it's all fake, it's nonsense. Yeah. Your own reporter said it's true. So at that point, you cease being a legitimate news organization, and you veered into pure propaganda.
I agree, and I think that cannot be that can't be downplayed when you're talking about, as you said, maybe 100,000 votes could swing the election one way or the other.
That was 2016,
right?
And the question is, what's your frame of reference for 2020? Right. Is it the presidential elections in 2016 that was so close, or is it the blowout of 2018
in the midterms?
And then the past year, clearly, so full disclosure, I thought in January, pre-pandemic, I thought based on 2018, Trump was going to lose in a landslide. That's my forecast for 2020. I'm not a political analyst. I don't invest based on that. That's just, bullshitting, having a beer, talking to people. Sure. Hey, I think it's a landslide. P.S. I thought he was going to lose. I thought it pre-pandemic. I was wrong about 2016. I thought he would lose, and he managed to just squeak it out. So take everything I say about electoral forecast with a grain of salt. That said, a number of things have happened this year. The pandemic should be fatal for any politician. But then you have you have the military supporting Biden. That's shocking. The military almost always votes Republican. You have a whole bunch of suburban women, college-educated suburban women, kind of surprised about being woke suddenly and recognizing the structural racism built into America. Now, I have friends who say, what part of 3/5 of vote, black people were 3/5 of a person in the Constitution? Did you not notice that from the beginning? That's the original sin. But it's just unavoidable to now. And then beyond the suburban housewife or the suburban mother or the suburban breadwinner is the response of the police nationally just tear gassing and batoning and beating peaceful protesters. I have heard from a number of people, and this might be my, college graduate coastal bubble.
Oh man, but I hate you because you're obviously one of those elitists they're always talking about.
Right. I went to a state school. I paid my way through college and grad school, so not quite elitist.
I know. I'm taking the piss, obviously. I mean,
But I think people were genuinely shocked by those videos, and the fact that the president couldn't recognize, hey, we've militarized our police. We have a problem here. And P.S., why do we send the police in for psychological issues, for family issues, for addiction issues? Shouldn't that be somebody who's a psychologist, a sociologist? Why are we sending in armed militia to deal with what are essentially nonviolent disputes? Whoever came up with the phrase defund the police is a marketing moron.
Yes.
But really, shouldn't we take some of the obligations that are not felony, not violent crime related, and give it to someone else. Let the police focus on crimes.
Yeah.
Right. On policing instead of being family counselors.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of people have kind of seen that, and the inexorable movement of history, the tide is going in a very specific direction. America's kind of odd in that we're governed from the right, but when you look at sentiment, when you look at polls, America is very much a center-left country. It's that the way things are distributed, and that big map of the United States of red and blue is very misleading because what is it? 60% of the population is east of the Mississippi. Most of what you see to the west is empty land. Land doesn't vote, people vote. You need to see a cartogram of it by population, and you realize we're a very purple country. Congress is far more divided than we are. Facebook and Twitter is not what the country is. Congress is not what the country is. We have much more in common than people realize, whether it's on abortion or gun rights. I mean, there's a whole run of gun control issues that the numbers are like 70 to 80% agreement. So division has been a very effective political technique. Hopefully that begins to change with a new regime in January, but you never can tell.
Yeah, I guess, just to sort of try and wrap this up, I think that, it's going to be interesting, obviously, our future rides on, what's going to happen this coming election in a quite significant way, because it's not just about economics. It's not just about the market. It's about, our culture. It's about how people interact with each other. Are we prepared to, really be a United States or not, And I think that clearly the issues are much deeper than, do you have money in your pocket? But at the end of the day, if you don't have money in your pocket, then people react in very different ways to their situations. So let me just sort of dial it back to the layman again for a while.
Sure.
Just for a minute to perhaps finish this up. For me, as I look at where we're at right now, I don't make a ton of money. I'm not in the stock market. I pay my bills. I'm lucky to, do this for a living and play music on the radio and do TV shows and whatnot. But, I have a mortgage and I have kids that I am hoping to figure out a way to put them through college and all this kind of stuff. My question is really about the basics that we all live with. If people can't afford to put a roof over their head, whether it's pay rent, and we're now seeing people getting kicked out of their places, or maintain a mortgage. Do you think the property market is safe? I mean, I see in my neighborhood, it's hot right now, but I also see more and more for sale signs going up as people are thinking, maybe I should get out now. I mean, where do you see that? Because that is an everyday impact on, millions.
So the big driver of the property market, recognize in most things in economics, there's a stasis between buyers and sellers, supply and demand. Part of the reason home prices went so crazy in 08, 09, really from 02 forward, is not only did we drop rates so low that we sent people out looking for anything that had some sort of a yield, and that turned out to be stacks of mortgages turned into it's called structured product. But we stopped asking people for their credit history or their job history. You remember the ninja loans, no income, no job, and all sorts of crazy stuff like that. So suddenly when you flood the market with 3, 4, 5 million, 10 million new buyers, prices go crazy. We're seeing a mini version of that now from all these people who live in big, expensive cities, and whether it's New York or Boston or DC or San Francisco or LA, saying, well, I'm paying big city rent and mortgage and taxes, but I get none of the benefits of being in a big city because I can't go to the museum, I can't go to a concert, I can't go to a show. Why am I spending all this money? And I'm stuck in an apartment or a small house. Let me move to the burbs. I'm working remotely, whether I'm in Manhattan or in one of the bedroom communities, or in downtown San Francisco or LA or one of the surrounding communities, I might as well move to some place where I could park my car in a garage. I have a backyard for the kids, and I have a so that's what's been driving this recent move. People going from the inner cities either to the outer cities or the suburbs. And, we were just talking about this the other day. I ended up here where I live. I'm about an hour commute into, now during the lockdown, I could drive into the city in 35 minutes.
Half an hour, yeah.
But it's like about an hour or so on the train. If I known I would be working from home, I could have moved a half hour further east, gotten a bigger house with more property for less money, and not worry about having to get. So that is sort of rejiggering, and no one really has a firm grip on how things are going to revert afterwards. And I was discussing this with one of my colleagues in the firm, I almost said in the office, who said, I don't ever need to go back into the city. It's so easy. He has a garden in his backyard. He's loving the work from home. Look, we're 6, and he just moved into that house 4 months ago. I think that at a certain point, people are going to be sick to death of being stuck in their house. They're going to want to go out. They're going to want to go to shows. Cities have been the center of energy, both for cultural and artistic, as well as economic and business for, 1,000 years. That's not a coincidence. Now, that said, certain things are clearly going to change. But let me point out that a lot of these changes have been in effect for a long time, and they're just accelerating now. So we have been over-retailed for decades. We've had too many malls, too many storefronts. I wrote a piece, I was just looking at my notes the other day, back in like 2009, about the ratio of per capita square footage of retail space, Japan versus Europe versus United States. Japan is tiny. It was like 4 square feet per person per capita versus of retail. I think Europe was like 7, 8. The United States was 23 square feet of retail space per person. It was just wildly excessive.
Yeah.
So that's changing. The adoption of technology. Look, we've had iPhones for how long? We've had FaceTime for how long? But, FaceTime was what grandparents did with their grandkids. Nobody wanted to be bothered with an intrusive FaceTime call. Now we FaceTime all the time. We Zoom all the time. So a lot of this technology adaptation has been brought forward. So we're probably 2, 3, 4 years ahead. Look, this was going to all happen in 5 or 10 years eventually. The lockdown probably brought all this forward. Work from home, work remote, that's been around for decades. This isn't anything new.
Right. It's
easier today because of the technology, because of the broadband, and all the software has made it very functional. But, we have a hard time imagining what life under lockdown was going to be like in the first month when it started. And now that we're 6 months into it, we're having a hard time imagining what's it going to be like when it's over. Right. We're very bad as a species at predicting our own emotions in the future. That's one of the reasons why people think money is going to make them happy. It turns out not to. If only I get the raise, the new job, the big house. And we are always shocked when, how come these things that I've wanted for so long aren't what brings me happiness? We're terrible at predicting our own emotional state.
So let me ask you one more question then that sort of ties into that. I know you've probably got other stuff to do, and I'm supposed to be on a meeting 10 minutes ago, but this has been such a fascinating conversation. And I'd love to do this again with you, maybe after the year, But I guess going back to retail, going back to commercial space, going back to homes, we talked about people moving out of the city. How does that shake down? I mean, are you going to have all this empty retail property, office space in major cities that's not going to be filled again? Are property prices going to come down in cities because everybody's bailing out? I mean, where do you see that going?
So that's the fascinating thing about economics, is it's this homeostatic system that always careens back and forth. An area gets hot, and then suddenly it gentrifies and prices out a lot of people, especially artists. And so then the area starts to cool off. And in the New York area, we've watched section after section after section of Manhattan and Brooklyn and Queens and other areas slowly get gentrified as people moved in looking for the next inexpensive place. So retail has completely shifted. You're going to see a lot of those replaced with more service-oriented businesses, as opposed to businesses with inventory and goods. It's really inefficient to have 100 stores and 100 stock rooms and 100 cashiers when, you know, companies like Shopify and Etsy, as well as Amazon and Target, do that much more efficiently. So service businesses tend to do well with that. I think there's going to end up being a shift of what was previously office space. A lot of that is going to start moving to residential, and that should bring prices down and attract more people to cities. So my office, we have 5,000 square feet. We have a floor and, a dozen people come into the office any given day, even though it could probably hold 15 pre-pandemic. And we had been discussing how many people would we need to hire before we need to add another floor. The pandemic has taught us, we could probably double the number of people in the office and we don't need to add another floor. And I have to imagine that's going to play out in a lot of different offices. You don't have to be there 5 days a week. You don't have to have that much square footage. You could platoon people. You're Monday, Tuesday. He's Wednesday, Thursday. Whoever wants to come on Fridays can, or week 1, week 2, week 3. There's lots of different ways to do it. The thought of you have to come in and have an office because your colleagues are there and all the papers of the firm are there. Well, when everything is in the cloud and everything is virtual, that need drops dramatically. You still need some interaction to create whatever your corporate culture is, especially if you want one. I think that's important. And that sort of live interaction is more important for some types of businesses than others. So it's tough to make a bet today against the vibrancy of urban centers. And again, it's 10 or more centuries that it's been the center of life around the world. In cities, not a coincidence. Humans are very social primates. We like to interact with other people. So I'm assuming that it's going to be different than it was pre-pandemic, but I don't think it's going to be unrecognizable. I think you're still going to see tourism. You're still going to see arts. You're still going to see all these things take place. The question is, if you're running a law firm and you have 20 lawyers and a bunch of paralegals and assistants, and the assistants are working from home, well, if they can do that in Iowa, where the salaries are a fraction of what they are in New York or San Francisco, are we going to see that sort of labor arbitrage? Listen, that's what happened with outsourcing to overseas manufacturing. Hey, once we don't have to pay U.S. workers, we could build this much cheaper.
Yeah.
What's going to happen with this? So that change could very well take place over the next couple of years. It'll be interesting to see if you and I are right and it's sometime next summer and we've been locked down for more than a year. Are people going to say, hey, this working from home and no commuting is great? Or people going to say, dear Lord, I got to get the hell out of the house. This is just torturous. I'll put up with a commute 3 days, 4 days a week. I just need a change of scenery.
Yeah.
I think it's tough to make that call today. But I think it's way early to call the end of cities. And I've seen a lot of people make that call, and I think they're way premature.
Well, listen, man, it has been such a pleasure talking to you. You've given me a lot to think about, and I appreciate that because, I'm not buried in this like you are, and you've made it understandable and digestible, and hopefully the people who are watching this will feel the same way. And let's make a date for, I don't know, end of January, February or something. And
sure. Assuming the world is still here, that would be fantastic.
Yeah. Great talking to you, Barry.
Same here, Nick. It was a pleasure.
Thanks, man.